Right. Good evening. Welcome to week 14. Last week we heard about Scotland and its role within the UK. This week, an overarching theme, which is policy making and external influences. Clearly, we've heard a great deal about Parliament. We will hear about select committees. We've heard about the civil service. But what we've not really heard about is how these institutions, these parts of the government system, are affected by the many pressures which in a society of this kind, Britain, are brought to bear on a relatively open, by international standards, system of government. Very important element in the whole question of our government system and indeed our democratic arrangements. And to speak to us tonight, Professor Edward Page from the Government Department here at the LSE.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm going to be talking about policy making and external influences. I will try. There'll be probably less on external influences, given the nature of British government, than there will be on policy making. One of the difficulties with talking about policy making, and is the language, I suppose, of policy and policy making, about decisions and decision making. And the idea is that somehow policy is a thing that's created at some stage, that it is made. We have the term decision making, which is, that we were all wandering along in a period of indecision until somebody actually makes a decision, and then the things actually change. And this is all part, I guess, and we talk about policy makers, the people who are actually in charge of making this, the men and women right at the top who are making the decisions, with other people playing bit parts, I suppose, or being not decision makers, because they're not decision makers. So I've sort of wanted to structure what I'm saying around this sort of idea that policy making is that we're sort of dominated by what you might call a heroic view of policy making. Here are the Greek heroes there. That policy is an act of creation. That we start off with an idea that of a problem, and people suddenly come up with ideas, and then you create the decision, you create the policy, then the rest is carrying out the policy. Policy is made by key creators with political skills. There are people who are, by their position, by their skill, right at the top of policy making, and they do the work. They are the ones that do it. And policy, I think, given that these people are heroes, there has to be something of a struggle. There's no point in being a hero if you don't have to struggle for something, if it's all handed to you on a plate. So policy is all about struggle and conflict. And conflict is what attracts us all as students of politics. Everybody likes watching a fight, according to Irving Schatzschneider. Conflict is contagious. People like looking at it. They like understanding it. And it's sort of not. It's pretty understandable that we have a view of policy making which is largely dominated by this what I'm going to call a heroic. Now, if I'm going to be contrasting this with another way of understanding policy making, and trying to find a term for it, I suppose, would be non-heroic, but that doesn't quite catch it. And I thought I'd use a phrase which my old friend Jack Hayward from Hull University, specialist on French politics, suggested many years ago, and in fact he suggested it just the other day when I was telling him about this as well. So I won't say that is the humdrum view of policy making. And here we have a bunch of lever arch files. That's my symbol. It's not the heroes. It is an office, and a very humdrum and boring office. And there's a different view of policy making. Policy making, according to this view, is a long haul. Max Weber said that politics is the long boring of holes in thick boards. And in a sense, this gets to what, in fact, the political part of this policy is about. It's about a long haul and changing things, that it takes a fairly long time to get things moving and a fairly long time to get things started. It's not a single act of decision. In fact, sometimes it's actually rather hard to think when the decision was actually taken. The second characteristic feature, I think, is that policy making is made with a cast of many, if not thousands. If it isn't your Cecil B. DeMille understanding of the way in which creating a movie experience with a cast of thousands, there are certainly quite a lot of people involved. That there are lots of, it's not only your politicians and a variety of politicians, you've got different kinds of civil servants from different departments doing different jobs. You've got your policy civil servants, you've got your specialists, you've got your accountants, you've got your lawyers above all, which I'll say a little bit more about. And these are the people who are involved in making an awful lot of politics. And you've also got the outsiders. You've got interest groups. You've got people who actually have got a few words to say about what they think government should be doing and what government should be doing. And they make their views known through interest groups. And these are an important part at times of understanding the way in which policy is made. And my third characteristic is policy as a product of procedure and routine. That people are making policy and developing doing activities which can be converted or turned into policy all the time. And all sorts of people are doing it. And that's the point I want to get across, that we can think about policy in two different ways. I'm not saying this is a superior way of thinking about policy. So I better explain what it is, why it is I'm bothering with the humdrum. Because we might say, actually, the humdrum part of policy is the uninteresting part. You know, that all of the interesting things, all the key decisions are taken by, you know, your heroic policymakers who are making the big choices. It is the little people that worry about the humdrum and the routine and all the rest of it. And I want to say that I don't think that's actually true. I think that in volume, at least, more policy work is closer to the humdrum than to the heroic. And you could come up with a whole variety of measures to make that particular point stand up. There were 3,000 last year. There were 3,457 statutory instruments as against 30 odd acts of parliament. Acts of parliament would be one indicator of your sort of heroic policy making document, although I'll maybe cast a bit of doubt on this later, whereas your more humdrum stuff, the stuff that is done every day within government, is far more voluminous. A second point I would make is that even heroic policy making needs the humdrum. So if we think of something that Tony knows very well, the community charge legislation, Mrs. Thatcher's community charge legislation, the 1988 Act had something like 250 clauses in it, I think, with an awful lot of detail. If you add the regulations that came out, there's probably about another 100 regulations. And even though it was Mrs. Thatcher's legislation, she probably didn't write most of those clauses or most of those regulations. But they were necessary, and they were necessary not simply to carry things out. There were a whole series of key issues which humdrum policy regulates, and I want to say a little bit about that. So one reason that we would look at this humdrum is to say we can't actually understand policy making without it. And the second, if I get time to say something about it, is to evaluate proposals for reform. Many of the diagnoses of what's wrong with policy making in Britain tend to emphasise the heroic side of the failure. It is the ministers, we don't have the right sorts of ministers, or the top level of the civil servants, the wrong sorts of people, and all those sorts of things. I think that we need, I suppose, to evaluate proposals for reform, we need to bring into, my argument is we need to bring into account the humdrum side of policy making. And I think that if we don't do that, and this is my second point, that reforms would be rather based on a faulty understanding of the different roles that people have. So this is my pitch for why I can tell you about things which are almost, the term tells you that they are actually quite hard to study, and, dare I say it, they can be boring, or they look boring. They look boring in the sense they're in dry documents. They seem to be about matters of detail and so on and so forth. Now, how am I going to present something which is inherently boring for another hour? I think that what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about policy making in Britain in terms of three stages. Since I've said there's no such thing as a decision, or it doesn't help us to think about a decision, I can't use the conventional way of talking about public policy about pre-decision and post-decision, because I've just said there isn't a decision. But let's leave that. So I'm talking about the early stages of policy making, which I will call a pre-legislative stage, which corresponds to agendas and alternatives. Those of you who've been following policy-making literature, there's a huge and now fashionable literature on policy agendas and how things come to the attention of politicians. The second stage, which I've called the middle, or the legislative stage, corresponds to what we largely understand by the notion of decision-making. You know, how are decisions made? What is it? What is the process of making decisions within British government? And then I'll look at the later stage, post-legislative stage, and see, and that really corresponds to implementation, or in New Labour speak, delivery, you know, how things are actually done, what actually happens on the ground. So I'm taking a fairly broad approach to understanding the whole nature of public policy making. And I'm going to take one case for demonstration purposes, the Proceeds of Crime Act 2002, to make some general points. Why have I chosen this one? Well, if I wanted to do something sort of interesting, it's an interesting case. The Proceeds of Crime Act was all about confiscating the proceeds of crime from organised criminals and actually from less organised criminals. And the idea was that if we can confiscate money from people, we can take more, we can make crime not pay, and the proceeds of crime can be used to finance a whole range of other things, but take it out of the criminal system. And this also fits. It also fitted the New Labour strategy as well. So we're not talking about something which was really marginal to what was going on at the time. It was it wasn't the key plank of New Labour policy, but it's a pretty important part of New Labour policy about combating crime and combating the causes of crime. So this is a sort of a reason for selecting it. And the second point I'd make is it's not actually typical of all legislation, because I think nothing is. All legislation, all policies have got their own particular points. But I think why I like it is that it features a blend of the humdrum and the apparent heroic. I suppose I should come clean. The third reason is it happens from bits of work I've done in the past that I happened to come across the Proceeds of Crime Act in its very early stages, and talking to some of the people who actually put the legislation together in different guises, of which I will say something about, which possibly explains why I've done this, because it's actually quite unusual to get sort of a knowledge of who was doing the sort of humdrum work and the type of issues that came up during this humdrum work, which were actually quite important policy issues. So let me go through this Proceeds of Crime Act and make some general comments about how it reflects more widely this heroic humdrum type of contrast that I was trying to get across. Before I do that, I should actually give a plug for, you probably had it before, the House of Commons Library research papers. Have you had people plugging those?
I'm not sure we have, but
Well,
100%, I had to write a chapter of a book recently, and they are absolutely wonderful.
They're fantastic resources for students of public
policy. I think we have
policy.
actually mentioned, I did mention, yes.
These are, they do outstanding research, and I will have to come clean that that I have used it very much in my own work. And if I want to find out what's going on in a particular bill that's before the House, or bill that was before the House many years ago, they're all on.
They're all online.
Online,
That's the
you can find out all sorts of things about. So many of the things I'm going to be saying you could find out from this, although I hope I'd add a little bit more than just simply telling you what was going on. There'll be a plug for the National Audit Office reports, but I still think these are really quite remarkable pieces of research from the House of Commons Library. Okay, let me start off with the pre-legislation. You can see I'm going to give you the heroic take on pre-legislation here. How did this issue arise as a policy problem? Why do people actually take it very seriously? Well, the sort of classic way of looking at this would be borrowed from the Kingdon book, which is on American public policy, but argues that there are a whole range of policy entrepreneurs who are waiting to exploit the chance to bring their favoured policy into being by waiting for the politics being right and so on and so forth. But these are sort of key policy entrepreneurs, usually politicians or senior policy wonks who manage to persuade politicians that what they're doing is worthwhile doing. And I guess the idea, the background to the whole of the performance and the Proceeds of Crime Act sort of reinforces that, or you can see it, you can certainly give a heroic slant on it. It fits the Blair agenda, as I've said before. A key aspect of Labour policy being that New Labour had to be tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime. And the whole thing arose from, or appeared to arise from, a study by the Performance and Innovation Unit, the in-house think tank within the Cabinet Office, I think at the time, and its report, Recovering the Proceeds of Crime, which came out in June 2000. This was then indicated that it was indicated that by Straw, who was targeting crime chiefs later on in 2001, that he was going to go after the crime chiefs, and he was included in the manifesto. And it was included in the manifesto, which I've got here, as renewing public services, criminal justice reform. We plan the most. New Labour believes that crime can only be cut by dealing with the causes of crime, as well as being tough on criminals. And the reference to the Proceeds of Crime Act was they were going to establish a new criminal assets recovery agency to seize assets of crime barons and a register of dealers to tackle drugs. But it was the crime barons they were after. They were going to get the crime barons. So this looks sort of heroic, and these things happened, and these things were important. I'm not saying they weren't important. But there are other things going on at the time which you would need to take into account if you wanted to give a proper explanation of the way in which this thing works. So let's go on to the humdrum view of it. The idea that you're seizing criminal assets, and it's a good thing to seize criminal assets, is not exactly new. It's been around for a long time. In fact, up until 1870, it was, according to this, I got this from the House of Commons Library, so I'm not it was a fairly common feature of English law that you could actually seize the assets until I think it was the Forfeiture Act of 1870. And after the Forfeiture Act, there are a number of acts of Parliament which allowed different organisations under specific circumstances to seize assets, criminal assets. And there was a report in 1984 by the Howard League for Penal Reform that suggested we should be doing more of this. So we're going back to the 80s. And this found its way, or this suggestion found its way into legislation after that, including the 1986 Drug Trafficking Offences Act, the Criminal Justice Act of 1988, and the 1994 Drug Trafficking Act. So it's not entirely new what was going on. This had been here before. One of the interesting things, and this is a thing that that was highlighted in the Performance Innovation Unit, was the idea of civil sequestration. That is to say that you can seize the assets of people which are presumed to be from the proceeds of crime, even if they haven't been convicted. That was one of the that you have to prove. This was one of the intentions behind it. There were yes, there's a different threshold. Yes, that's right. And that was the intention behind it in the Performance Innovation Unit. Well, I'll say a little bit about that in a second. But then there were a variety of other reports. I've listed some of the reports here. There was the House of Commons Home Affairs Committee, which actually said the Home Office Working Group on Confiscation should keep this idea of extending confiscation going and look into it more. There was the Home Office Police Research Group in 1995, and the Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary in 2000. They were all put their three halfpence worth, if they pardon the pun, into this whole question of legislating on extending confiscation, which seemed to be a very good idea. So it was floating around at the time, and lots of people were talking about it. I guess from the late 1980s on, it was a very seriously intended. It was brought into some legislation. And in fact, so much so that in the House of Lords debate, one of the Lords, and I'll say a little bit about this later, argued that it was essentially a consolidation act, that you were actually bringing together existing legislation and not really doing very much that was new. So what was the impact of the Performance and Innovation Unit report? This is this Blairite, the internal think tank. Jeff Mulgan, I think, was running it at the time, if I remember rightly. Talking to the people who were actually involved in writing the legislation, they didn't really think that, I'll say again, come on to this in a second, they didn't really think that the Performance and Innovation Unit report added very much to the policy. If you read the Performance and Innovation Unit report, it says variants on the phrase criminals don't like to have their money taken away from them. They really don't like to have the money taken away from them. And then they will show you that in South Africa they do this, and they really don't like it taken away from them in South Africa, and they really don't like it taken away from them in Ireland. I mean, I'm parodying a little bit, as you could. You don't think you would write a Performance and Innovation Unit report like that, but it didn't. It made the case that you should do it, but it said very little about the policy that you were actually going to, the shape the policy should take. So, what was the impact of the Performance and Innovation Unit? I think it was sort of more attention rather than substance of policy. That is to say that it was taken as a serious, this idea had been floating around for a long time, and by putting it into this high visibility unit, it was something that was beginning to take seriously. So, if I were trying to give some sort of observations on pre-legislation before I go on to the legislation side, I would say policies are quite often a mix of old and new. There was a book which hasn't stood the test of time by Brian Hogwood and Guy Peters called Policy Succession, where they argue broadly that there aren't any new policies around, or there are very few new policies around, that most policies involve quite a substantial degree of succession, of incorporating old policies and just adding a new bit onto them. And they try to argue this in the case of setting up the National Health Service after the Second World War, and so they picked some sort of fairly big cases and they tried to show this. But whether you swallow that argument entirely or not, I think that it's very hard to get away from the fact that many new policies have got large elements of old policies in them. It's very hard to find something which is absolutely new. I think the second point about this is that it's extremely important. It's extremely difficult to pin down exactly how the idea for a new policy arose. There were so many people who were talking about this that it's virtually impossible to say that one person was absolutely critical. An extremely good research report which got an awful lot of attention was by Mike Levy from Cardiff, which was written for the Home Office working body, but I don't think he would claim that he was the cause of this. There were lots of people who were talking about it, and so it's very difficult to pin down. I think we have to think about the third point I'd make is the importance of routine processes. That committee meetings, working group meetings, things which are scheduled, these are where an awful lot of policy tends to emerge from. So we'd have the importance of routines. I'm not trying to say that politics and political and the heroic is unimportant. Signalling something as a priority is extremely important. If you want to get legislation passed, there is, not always, but usually, it's actually a rather crowded legislative timetable. You have the opportunities for passing legislation. So you have to get some sort of political priority behind it, and getting permission to do some legislation, to get a slot where you're going to do legislation, is extremely difficult. And the Prime Minister being on your side and thinking it's important is actually pretty good in getting those sorts of resources. And I think also you can't deny the significance of electoral politics, that the whole proceeds of crime issue is something which was good electorally. It was good for the new Labour take on crime. So I'm not saying it's unimportant, but we can't really understand how this arose as an issue which was taken seriously in public policy without thinking about the more humdrum aspects of it. Okay, so let me move on to the legislative side. And here we have great debate in front of the House. This is our heroic side. the Proceeds of Crime bill was launched, actually it's a draft bill. The idea was that you put forward the legislation in draft form, people can debate it, interest groups can look at it and decide whether they like it or not, they can propose amendments, people can point out problems that there are, and so on. And you, if you're thinking about the heroic and giving a heroic account of it, you would look at the parliamentary stages of the legislation and the divisions. So actually, one of the points that's probably worth making about humdrum policy making is that many bills before Parliament aren't divisive in partisan terms. That around about half, depending on when you're talking about and what legislation you're talking about, don't have divisions or partisan divisions on second or significant third reading divisions. Second reading is usually taken as the sort of measure of how partisan. But there were divisions in this one, so it fits as sort of a heroic. There was opposition, and the opposition was largely about, I suppose, human rights, the idea that you're having money taken away from you if you haven't done anything wrong. You know, this is some people might be squeamish about this and think that maybe we ought to have due process to make sure that people have things taken away from them under due process. And there were some defeats, and I think there were notably 3 defeats and some changes. And I'll say something a little bit about who was making these changes. But this is, if you like, the heroic side. You're debating it, setting out the point, defeating all the naysayers, and which you can do if you've got a majority, and accepting some changes that you expect to want to implement. Now, the reason this seems as though I'm sort of going back in time a bit here in this whole process, because we're already in Parliament, but there's a whole process of legislation that takes place before you go into Parliament, before this bill comes up. If you think about policy, if you think about something like the Performance Innovation Unit or even the party manifesto, they're really just giving you an intention. They're just saying what we would like to happen in very, very broad terms. If you want to get a public policy in place, if you want legislation in place that's going to do something like this one, which is confiscating money, you have to be a little bit specific about who you're going to confiscate money from, what sort of money you're allowed to confiscate, what procedures you have to go to confiscate it, and the powers of all different people within the judicial system or the expectations that people have. So you can't just simply say, go out and get me a law which says we are going to confiscate money from criminals. You have to give a whole series of detailed accounts, detailed instructions that are actually going to work. If you look at the Proceeds of Crime Act, it contains 450 clauses. Very long piece of legislation, which has got all sorts of things, such as how you define a criminal lifestyle is one of the clauses in it. Another clause looks at the position of the powers of the court and the receiver within the court, and loads of stuff on that. There's a section on how it's all going to work in Scotland, which has got a different system of law. I could go on, but this would be the whole point I'm trying to make is there are an awful lot of detailed things that you're going to have to find out before you're going to make a piece of legislation. You can't just put it up like that. There are some pieces of legislation. I was trying to think of one. I think the Fixed Term Parliament Act of 2011 is actually quite short. It's about 7 clauses, which I think you could imagine one person actually writing that, but you couldn't imagine people writing the poll tax or certainly the Proceeds of Crime legislation. So who does all this stuff, and what is this at all of interest? Is this sort of automatically? Well, I think there are key groups of people who are involved in writing legislation before it actually gets to Parliament. The bill teams, that is to say, this is a group of civil servants. It's not always the same number of civil servants, but these would be civil servants within the Home Office, possibly getting civil servants from outside the Home Office for relevant parts of it, who, the way in which it works is they devise the policy, they instruct their lawyer, who then instructs Parliamentary Council. Very interesting bunch of people whose sole job, or almost sole job, is to write legislation. That's what they do all the time. And nobody else writes primary legislation, or very, very rarely. It's not worth thinking about other people that write primary legislation, and they are instructed by the solicitors to write the legislation. And they write a draft of the legislation, they send it back to the lawyer, and the lawyer will look at it and send it back to the bill team, and the bill team will look at it and say, we don't like it, and so on and so forth.
These people are private, aren't they? They're this council. Are they outside?
No, they're part of, I think they're now in the Cabinet Office. They've been around for a very long time. Right. One of the interesting things about them, which I think is one of the most interesting things about them, is that they're the only place in the whole process for anything complicated who look at the bill in its entirety, from beginning to end. You've got lots of people looking at different sections and responsibility for different sections. The way in which they think about their role is very much in terms of creating a coherent whole for a piece of legislation. This is the question about who writes the stuff. It's bill teams, Parliamentary Council, and for the Proceeds of Crime Act, I can't remember how many. If you go to Parliamentary Council office, they've got records going back to the 19th century, which have got all the correspondence they enter into with the departments over a bill. I think there was something like 25 or 30 files about that thick on the Proceeds of Crime bill, as it was. Don't quote me on the exact number, but it's a huge amount of writing that's involved in all of this. That's one of the reasons why I was attracted by My Sign of the Humdrum. And what's the picture here? This is the picture from the famous nursery, the fairy tale of Rumpelstiltskin, where I think it was the miller's daughter was asked to spin straw into gold. Remember that, was it? I think it was a miller's daughter, or was it a farmer's daughter? And one of several of the people who are writing legislation from bill teams see their role very much as spinning straw, basically pour raw material of what it is that politicians want into a piece of legislation, which is going to stand up not only to Parliament, it's going to be able to stand up through the court system, it's going to be seen as valid legislation which is specific enough to allow judges to make decisions which are going to take money away from people, putting it sort of bluntly. Now, in this question, I think in this area, it wasn't really a matter of just simply defining or putting footnotes to what the politicians had already decided. There were a whole series of issues which were decided at this sort of pre-legislative phase by the bill teams working in conjunction with Parliamentary Council. A range of issues, including whose money do you go after? Do you go after the spouse or the partner of the person who you're? Under what circumstances can you do that? How is Scotland going to fit in? That you actually, this was an issue which was a devolved issue, which meant technically, I think you have to have a Sewell motion. You probably would have spoken about those on Scotland at all.
We did. No.
But you have to square it with Scotland. You had to make sure that they were in favour. And in fact, in Scotland, if I remember correctly, the Advocate General was keen to make sure that the civil sequestration was kept within Scotland because it was a sort of pretty big symbolic issue. So key issues can be settled. Who is going to do the collecting of the money? Under what circumstances? How are they going to do it? The logic of the legislation was also, this point I made about Parliamentary Council. They like to think of, Parliamentary Council aren't legal technicians, or they don't see themselves primarily as legal technicians. They see themselves almost as artists or lobbyists or novelists, in the sense that they want to see what's the basic meaning, what's the basic structure of this legislation, how is it actually going to work as a whole? And they like to get that straight beforehand, before they do these things. They don't just translate things. So there's quite a degree of creativity in there. Now, I should be able to say a little bit more about lobbies and the heading off of opposition. There was some lobbying on this legislation. There was lobbying in favour from the chief police officers. I think were very much in favour of it. Those who were against included, or had reservations, I don't think they were against it, included the accountants, because there was a proposal in the legislation that accountants should be made to shop their clients, which they weren't very happy about, and I think Law Society was also concerned about that. And you had Liberty, the idea of the sort of human rights people who were actually trying to lobby. And so why would this be important? Well, bill teams want to come up with legislation which is going to pass, which is not going to raise the sort of opposition which is going to create problems for their minister and ultimately problems for them. Because if the minister's not happy with it, they've got to go back to the drawing board. So they do have to bear in mind what the lobbies are interested in doing and try to head off some of the problems that they have. A couple of final points I'd make about this process is that the people who were involved in writing the stuff were at a surprisingly junior level. When I went in to study some bill teams, I studied 4 or 5 of them around the time, it was around about 2001. 2002, I thought there was going to be a senior civil servant who was in charge of the whole thing. And in some cases, nominally, there was a senior civil servant who was in charge of the team. But most of the work was done at a level below the senior civil service. So it would be, in the old terms, grade 7, which is just below the senior civil service level, and even higher and senior executive officers below that. So people 1, 2, 3 ranks below the very senior level of the civil service. And some, one of the bill teams I looked at were surprisingly young people. I don't think there was any. I think one of the senior members of the team, who was probably just over 30, was telling me that nobody else was anywhere approaching his age in terms of one of. This was not this bill, I hasten to add. It was another. And the second point is one I've sort of more or less discussed already, and that is this idea of parliamentary counsel as a prospective policy analyst. It's what is strange to report that one of the few stages in some of the pieces of legislation I looked at where anybody said, how does this all hang together? How does this work as a piece of legislation? Happened to be the Parliamentary Council. And they looked at it from the point of view of, will this stand up in court? Is this going to last? Rather than, will it necessarily produce the amount of returns in terms of funds that we're going to seize from these criminals. So it's a rather strange, very interesting group of people, as I've sort of probably done to death at the moment. Okay, what sort of observation can you make on this process? Remember, this process of making policy is interpreting some sort of broad instruction, because you have to have some idea that you're going to be able to legislate in this particular area. Otherwise, there is going to be a legislative slot, or you've got some reason to think there's a legislative slot. It is something which is done largely by civil servants. Civil servants are a long way away from the very top of the civil service. So does this mean that we're talking about a policy and a process of policy making where key issues about what the shape of the legislation is going to be like are decided by bureaucrats? I think no is the simple answer. It is not saying that bureaucrats are out of control or doing things, because for the second point is that there is the importance of anticipated reactions and other cues. When you ask civil servants to do something, to do a piece of policy, especially a piece of policy which is a high priority for the government ministers and for the Prime Minister, civil servants make pretty big efforts to find out what it is they think the minister wants. They're not going to start doing stuff which, they're not going to build in loopholes into the legislation so, crack dealers can find a way through it or subvert it in any particular way. That they're going to try to do their best to come up with a piece of legislation that seems to do what the government seems to want it to do. I think that's probably the best way of putting it. They will look for all sorts of other cues. They will look into the Performance and Innovation Unit to see if there is any particular stuff that they can get from there. But as I've already said, I've got a couple of quotes, but I won't dig them out, where I asked about the Performance and Innovation Unit report, and they just said it wasn't really much help to us. There's no real policy that was done within it. The other reason it isn't out of control, or the whole process isn't out of control, is that civil servants, where they're actually making choices, or where they think they're making choices, even if they're choices that they don't think that the minister has ever thought about, or nobody's ever thought about, because they haven't gone into it in that sort of really important detail which has got pretty big implications for the, how big the policy is going to be, who is it going to target, these sorts of things. If you get them wrong, you could end up with a piece of legislation which targets hardly anybody. So when they were making what they thought to be pretty big choices, they would look for explicit approval from a minister. Am I doing this right? This is the sort of decision we're taking, Minister. Is this what you want? Or else it would be expecting some sort of tacit approval, just letting the minister know what they're doing, and if the minister doesn't shout about it, then you're going to be okay. I would also, this was all done in early 2000. The SPADs, special advisors, who I've not said very much about, I didn't come across them very much in my study, but that could possibly be because of the nature of the legislation. You would expect them to be at least involved in some of this. The other point I'd make about this process is, the interesting thing is that when you think about lobbying, and even lobbying in the legislative process, that is to say when it's going through Parliament, when interest groups such as your accountants want to get things changed, they brief the opposition in hope that they will get some amendments. But when they're briefing the opposition, they actually brief the civil servants first, because what will happen is that the opposition will raise their points and the minister will say, is this something we should pay attention to? And if they've made their case, if the interest groups have actually made their case to the bureaucrats, they've got to hope that the bureaucrats are actually going to be on their side. And this, I'm not saying it always happens, but it's not exactly a government versus opposition dynamic here. It's that it helps to keep the bureaucracy on your side, because they can then interpret what it is you're trying to do. While we're on legislation, I should say that it's not only legislation isn't only about acts of Parliament. If you're thinking about the Proceeds of Crime Act, there were at least 55 regulations published after that. These are things with the force of law which actually carry out and define terms within the way the legislation works. And they come out with here as a draft statutory instrument to show you what they look like. I spent far too long in my youth worrying about statutory instruments and studying statutory instruments. And I've listed just some of the regulations that have come up from here. So policy work doesn't stop when the legislation is put in.
It's worth adding, these have to be subject to their own resolutions.
They have to be. Yes. That's. I can. Yes. It depends on the parent legislation about what sort of all the clause of the parent legislation, whether they have to be put before Parliament or in what circumstances they need to be put before. This one is for draft approval of each house. So it says it at the top, and it will tell you what section it's issued under. And there are loads of those. And there's other stuff which we probably know less about, and that's guidance, that you have to explain to people how the thing works. And this could also have in principle, it doesn't have the force of law, I think, although a lawyer might tell me differently, but it can, in effect, define what the law is if you're talking about the guidance. So there's all this sort of policy work which is going on, which makes for a very... which means that this is all your humdrum stuff, and there's quite a lot of humdrum stuff that's needed to put any legislation into force. And the Proceeds of Crime Act is certainly not unusual. I think it's unusual in the volume of stuff that comes from it, but it's not unusual for a piece of legislation to generate quite a bit of regulation and guidance as well. As I say, this one was quite a big one. Okay. Let me go on then to post-legislation. So we've got the Proceeds of Crime Act on the books, and we've started to implement it through implementing regulations. And we set up, one of the things it did was it set up the Assets Recovery Agency, which was supposed to be responsible for making sure that people start seizing assets of criminals. It's no good having this stuff on the books if nobody's actually going to do it. And after a while, it became clear that the thing wasn't actually working particularly well. Let me give you a quote from the National Audit Office report, which I'll mention a bit later on. In 2003 to 4, the Assets Recovery Agency spent £11.1 million and recovered £2,000. But that was its first year. That's fair enough. You wouldn't expect anything particularly large. The next year, they spent 14.1 million and recovered 4.3 million. They spent 23.6 million in 2005 to 6 and recovered 6.4 million. Now, you don't need to be a genius to say, well, you could argue that you can't measure the disruptive effect of this legislation on crime simply by the amounts of money that is recovered. But that's wearing a little bit thin when you're talking about sort of that order of expenditure and that order of change. And so for this is just, there were several attempts to try to make this thing work better. And if you like, the top brass issue, the top brass way of dealing with this, I've mentioned 4 things which are sort of fairly, this is how heroes deal with things. They develop a strategy. They look at the way, the whole way in which this thing is supposed to work and identify weaknesses in particular forms of organisational particular procedures. They can identify weaknesses in the leadership, although the leader of the Assets Recovery Agency, when it was reformed or restructured, merged, abolished actually, resigned, was certainly not sacked. I think it was Judith Earle, Jane Earle, ex-chief executive from local government. She resigned on family grounds, so she wasn't exactly sacked. Changing the organisation. That's another classic thing. If it's not working, it must be because it's in the wrong organisation or there's something wrong with the organisation that we can actually change it. And this was in a period where the notion of delivery was still sort of pretty strong. It was the idea that we had to have units within government which were chasing up things. And I think the delivery unit it was in number 10, I think, was chasing, had a couple of reports on this, which was trying to get the thing working and get the thing working better. So that's, if you like, the sort of the heroic response to it. I think that there are, if you wanted to understand what went wrong, you have to look at sort of, there's nothing wrong with saying that the heroes weren't right about things, but there are an awful lot of other things that were actually going wrong or going on within this process. There were a range of evaluations of what has gone wrong, and you can have a look at them. But the latest one was the National Audit Office one in 2013. And they pointed, I can't go through the whole report, but they pointed up a range of things which were actually wrong with the process of policy, the whole way in which the legislation was working. One of the points they make is criminals are pretty clever. They can hide money, they can take it away, and they can put it in places where it's actually rather hard to get hold of, which is a bit of a flaw. They're not going to come along and say, all right, it's a fair cop, here's my billions. And the assets are hard to identify, and they have to be the subject of successful confiscation orders, that they have to go through due process. And, it's quite possible to order that people are liable to pay the money, trying to get the money off them, especially if they say, no thanks, Gov, I'll take my 2 years in prison, thank you very much, for my 20 million quid. This is all rather difficult, and these sorts of things are set out in the National Audit Office. The attrition rate was extremely high. They also point to an organisational problem. I'm not sure whether this is going to work because I had to get 2 pages of a report into one, and you can see the joins here. I apologise for the joins. But this is what they call the confiscation order landscape. There are an awful lot of people involved in making confiscation orders. And part of the problem, they argue, is that there is no way in which, within the system, you can do things like coordinate, because they're all rather different organisations. Informing people of what the other one is doing. Above all, prioritising. Is it really worth going after this criminal? Because are we going to get any money out of them? And what are the chances of success in doing all of these things is what the National Audit Office highlights. They highlighted also as a problem of incentives. Why should anybody be bothered to do this? What is in it for them to spend time, because they've got other things to do? Why should they actually do anything about it? And they highlight even sort of minor things which they regard as important. It's, I suppose, a subset of the organisational problem, the ICT problems. All of them are using different, all of the agencies involved, or many of the agencies involved, are using different IT systems which are not comparable. Some of them are old-fashioned, and it's basically manual stuff being entered into computers, and so on and so forth. So they highlight a series of problems with it. And that's why, if you look at the agency, it has a whole, we're talking about a vast number of orders, but actually the amount of money actually being confiscated is somewhat more limited. And this is, if you like, but you can look at for the actual figures of money amounts in the National Audit Office report, which sort of takes us round full circle, because if you look at the Serious Crime Bill, and this is another House of Commons research paper, they are amending the Proceeds of Crime Act to try to deal with some of these problems, because it has been the subject of quite a lot of debate within government, a lot of it conforming to my sort of humdrum picture of how you're actually going to change the legislation to make it more likely that you're going to get some serious sorts of confiscation. So we're back with another round, I guess, of policy and policy making. Okay, and as I think Richard Rose, my former PhD supervisor, would say, the juggernaut of incrementalism rolls on. That you're getting more and more, you're getting more changes to public policy, and that it's going to change. It's going to come out fairly soon. Okay, let me finish then with a. I'm not quite sure why it's done that. It didn't do that in the printout, but I guess. So let's see if I can get it. I've got some normative and some empirical conclusions.
The title has somehow moved.
Well, I'll leave it up there, and we'll worry about.
The title has moved somehow.
Basically, I've got a set of empirical problems. It hasn't come out to. Not sure whether it's. Yeah. Okay. Basically, my conclusions are that policies are a mix of the heroic and the humdrum. But to understand the way in which policy is made, it's no good looking at the way in which a key set of decision makers, relatively small handful of decision makers, at the senior level, are the people who make decisions. They're involved in policy making, and they have an important role to play in policy making, a pretty decisive role to play in policy making at sometimes. I'm not denying that. But if you actually want to understand what is going on in government, you need to understand that even the heroic policies usually have some humdrum side to them. Possibly the Fixed Term Parliament Act would be one of your rare exceptions, but if you look at any big policy, especially one which produces complex legislation, you're going to have quite a lot of people involved in making it. The basic legitimacy requires the intervention of heroes. That is to say, that no civil servant thinks it's their job to produce legislation which they want to produce because they think it's important. Almost everybody I've ever interviewed who's been doing legislation would insist that the only point in doing this is because they've got a political imperative that they should be doing this sort of legislation, even if it's stuff that the ministers have never actually thought about before. So, one of the other pieces of legislation I looked at was about the land registry and reforming the land registry. This isn't something that was on the top of politicians' minds at the time, but it was something that emerged from a sort of humdrum review of the way in which policy was working to try to get land registration into the away from the 18th century and into the 20th and 21st century, 21st century at the time. But it requires the intervention of of ministers in that, and it's not something that they're doing. So even the most heroic needs the humdrum, and we can't understand the policy without understanding humdrum. I think the second point, and this is where I would say it's not only a matter of understanding, it's also a matter of diagnosing what the problems are within British government. So I think it's quite irritating to see discussions about what is wrong with the British civil service. And I'm not defending the civil service or saying that it's a marvellous institution, it doesn't need reform. But many of the reforms and the proposals of reform are based on some rather strange assumptions about what it is that civil servants do. We have this assumption that we're reforming the civil service, we want to reform the senior civil service because that's the most important bit, and we want to look at the policy-making role of senior civil servants. Well, they do have a policy-making role, but probably not in the way you think they do. They have a role which is very much often at quite a degree of remove from what it is that's going on in terms of the detailed consideration of policy issues that's going on in government. So I suppose the points I would raise, I want to leave you with, in terms of the normative part of it, is that thinking about reform and problems of reform and policy often emphasises heroic causes of failure. The book by Tony King and Ivor Crewe, for example, which I don't know whether it's on the reading list, but they did a book on blunders of government. And if you look at the diagnosis, it's a very well-argued, well-reasoned book, but an awful lot of the causes of it are sort of heroic failures. That is to say, it's basically our party system, the way in which the party system works, the way in which Parliament works, that ministers haven't got enough incentives to do policy in particular ways, and all those sorts of things. And I think it concentrates on the question of leadership. If you're wanting to try to work out what was going wrong with Proceeds of Crime Act, I don't think it helps to concentrate entirely on the sort of the top level and the heroic failures. There are all sorts of problems about the way in which the thing was designed and who was involved in the design, which are more likely to help you understand broader problems of failure. I think the second point I would make is that it sort of leads you, if you concentrate on the heroic, it leads you to look in the wrong place for remedies. I think it's quite interesting that one of the big reforms, which is of the Conservative, of the coalition, pushed by Conservatives, is the extended ministerial offices. This idea that you have more people around the minister who help the minister to run the department. I'm not entirely sure that I don't know what diagnosis they have for that being the problem. We need more people within the department to run the civil service because civil servants don't pay attention. It's very, very hard to find a civil servant, even at a fairly junior level, that doesn't seriously try to work out what it is that a minister's trying to do or wants to do. Or that bureaucrats, according to the sort of public choice theory approach to bureaucracy, bureaucrats are supposed to shirk or to subvert public policies. It's very, very difficult to find any evidence of that whatsoever. And you wonder what particular problem the extended ministerial offices themselves is trying to solve. And in fact, you could argue that if you think about this whole question about humdrum policy making, that having more people around the minister is another way of separating the minister from this humdrum world, protecting the minister. They don't have to get involved in any of this sort of detail because they've got minions that do it for them. They don't do it themselves. This is the sort of the argument which in the United States is called the argument about thickening government, the idea that you surround your political executives with lots of people who are supposed to do things for them. This can cause problems, as many problems. In fact, according to Paul Light, it causes more problems than it actually solves. And the third point, I guess, I would, and I haven't really said enough about it because it's I should have done, but it's a relatively little time, is failing to identify things that work well. One of the great heroes of the humdrum world, I think, or the more humdrum world, is the House of Lords. If you want to actually understand the civil servants that I spoke to that were doing the Proceeds of Crime legislation and many other bits of legislation were more worried about what was going to be said in the House of Lords than the House of Commons, and they had reason to be, because they got defeated in the House of Lords, and the House of Lords is actually subjecting things to quite a lot of defeat. Now, there might be a pretty good democratic reason for getting rid of the House of Lords. This isn't a pitch for the House of Lords, but you have to recognise that there's a particularly important function of government which is going to be demolished if you do that, and what are you going to replace it with, or are you happy to see it go? So my third point about reform is, let's not throw out things that seem to work well, but we don't really think they work well, or we don't know how well they work because we're too busy looking elsewhere. So
thank you very much. Very good. Thank you. Excellent. Can I just come back to you on that last point? Because by implication, the Lords is described as a revising chamber, and it can't stop the government's legislation beyond a point. It can delay it, but it can't stop it by convention. But the implication of what you've said is that another element in legislative improvement would be, in theory at least, at the Commons Committee stage. That is, that when the legislation, having had its second reading, it has this allegedly deliberative stage in a committee. Now, you mentioned the draft bill stage, which not all bills, I think, have, right, but some now do. And sometimes they get pre-legislative scrutiny in that form. Right, yes. But in a sense, the committee stage, if I question by implication, is not as good, which is a question, not a statement, not as good at improving legislation as either lobbyists coming in the way you've described them, or the House of Lords with its revising role. Question.
Answer is an honest answer, that the work that I did on the detail was was a few years ago. The impression that I got was that ultimately majorities settled questions in the House of Commons, and as long as your minister wanted something, it wasn't an awful lot necessarily to worry about. It was only the House of Lords which raised a whole series of problems which gave people in the House of Commons pause for thought and thinking of that's the way, as I understand it, it worked. It might have changed then. I suppose I'll have to look at studies, but we don't have a huge number of studies about how the committee system is working in terms of legislation.
No, we don't. And the other implication is, which is clear from what we heard about Parliament, is that individual MPs, as opposed to the government, the executive, have very little role in creating policy. It's not to say they can't, but you might argue that that individual MPs would be as likely to have an impact through a lobbying organisation like a think tank than they can by talking, even if they're a member of the government party. Again, is that a reasonable observation?
Yes, and the point, coming from spending a lot of my time in the University of Hull, where I was, Philip Norton was my colleague, of course. Individual MPs are becoming far more rebellious than they used to be. So it's a rather different environment that we're talking about. I think even now than certainly in the early years of the Blair administration.
Okay, the other observation I would just have is that it's something you hinted at, which is that I've certainly looked at legislation myself which applies to local government in the past. And the observation has been made to me that the legislation would not allow you to operate the system unless you knew what the system was. If you say, you couldn't infer the system of local government finance from the legislation. There's simply the legislation has been put in place to allow a or already operating system to be changed somewhat. And is that a common way? Is it often
there were all sorts of reasons for putting things in legislation. One of the things that I found sort of quite interesting about when talking to people that did legislation is they were just reenacting things all the time. Yeah. Partly because legislation is a bit of dramaturgy. It's sort of, we want to tell a story, and you can't tell a story just by saying this act amends Section 23 Clause 4 and like some legislation in continental European countries does. It's just not the way it works. So I think that legislation sometimes does try to tell a story too. Especially, the Proceeds of Crime Act. It's the title tells you what it's doing.
The title, yes, the title, yes. The Dangerous Dogs Act.
Yeah, that's right.
Dangerous Dogs Act. I wonder what that was about. Okay, now, any points? Yes, I'll take one from the middle there. Yeah, they'll come. Oh, yes, I'm sorry, the microphone arrived. Sorry, I'll take one there, one here. In the middle then.
Thank you. You stressed the importance of humdrum politics, but compared to most continental countries, Britain has the reputation of being one with a rather small bureaucracy. How would you compare them? Do you agree that continental countries have a much more complex, huge system of humdrum politics?
That's a very good question. I have, as Sherlock Holmes would say, done a monograph on this, which nobody reads, but I've given you a chance to say something about it. If you actually look at the way in which humdrum politics works, or the humdrum policy making works in other countries, there are quite a large number of similarities. I mean, this basic idea that civil servants are anticipating reactions is pretty much widespread. The types of constraints on them, the political constraints on them, is also there. The idea that politicians tend to keep their hands away from civil servants in doing this is pretty widespread, strangely enough, with the exception of Sweden, for reasons I could possibly go into. I've only looked at Sweden, Germany, France, United States, Britain, and the European Union. And Sweden was the only place where the politicians really seemed to get an awful lot more involved in what would be considered the detailed policy issues of how you put something together. So I don't think it's actually that unusual. The procedures are extremely different. I mean, if I were going to Germany, I would be... the first thing that a civil servant would tell me is what the law was already, and they would know chapter and verse about the law and the procedure and so on and so forth. But whereas your British civil servant has probably only just come to their job. This is a point I should have made as well. The British civil servants, some of the people who are in their 20s who are writing bills have only actually just got a job in a government department, or relatively recently got a job in a government department. And that contrasts with some other countries, and it contrasts a little bit with the European Union, a little bit with Germany. So there are differences, but I think the basic point is very similar. And as I sort of mentioned, it also sort of chimes in with my great colleague Jack Hayward, who's done stuff on France. There is, you have to understand the way in which individual departments and agencies interact with each other to understand how policy is made, and that point arises in France as well. So there are differences, but not enough where you would say that Britain is more humdrum than anywhere else. Possibly it is slightly less humdrum, but I'm not sure what metric you could possibly use to say that.
Does the fact that junior civil servants are doing this, is the implication, without being disrespectful to them, that this is low status work?
No, actually it's not low status
training work.
It's regarded as you get people who you get a very from memory you get a mix of different types. You did get a mix. I mean, I haven't been around, but at the time the Assets Recovery Agency, the Proceeds of Crime Act, was being done, you had a mix. You had your people who'd been around the Home Office in sort of units to do with crime for a long time. You got your high flyers who were coming in, and it is regarded, doing a bill is regarded actually as, by some, as a good job, because you get ministerial contact, there's visibility, you get Parliament work. Other people would say it's a pain in the backside, but quite a large number of people quite like it, and they quite like the thrill of having to, you have to keep the hours, late nights to get things written up in time, and there's a sort of a thrill in doing it.
And you sit in the House of Commons.
You sit in the box in the House of
Commons,
and you pass things to the minister, and you get involved in the political process by trying to fend off criticisms and make points, and you sort of cheer as they win, and your heart sinks when the minister commits to a change that you don't think the minister should have committed to, and all those sorts of things. So it does seem to have a thrill in that sense in doing this work.
Yeah, and you can see these, character people in the box behind or on the side. If you're looking into the House of Commons, down the chamber towards the ministers, so as it were, just further beyond on the far wall behind the speaker on the government side, they have civil servants, and they do, of course, given Parliament is a fairly traditional institution, pass pieces of paper. There's no screens or anything, or they probably may do it on mobile phones, actually, I don't know. Anyway, sorry, another question here. Get the microphone round to...
Thank you for your talk. This criminal bill so failed. Is that not proof that there is a very powerful criminal lobbying group over government? And if that's the case, is there a group in government that does monitor and identify powerful lobbying groups and how they use government, and also the process that they use to control policies that are made in government?
Well, I think that I wouldn't say that this piece of legislation arose because of a particularly powerful lobby.
I mean, all the amendments, just make it...
Yes, but there are lots of different people who are wanting amendments, for sort of understandable reasons. None of them were...
Organised crime was not itself
and also the legislation
directly.
that came in. I mean, the civil servants were actually slightly surprised by what they thought they could get away with. They didn't think they would get away with some of them.
There must be a very pourpowerful lobbying group from the criminal side of it. Is that not...
No, there isn't.
I doubt
criminal,
on this.
There's no... I mean, unless the Law Society...
are not stupid, and that does infer that major policymakers are stupid then? No, it doesn't. It just means that they are going to react. They're going to react to what the government does by taking countermeasures, which are going to be very, very hard to predict. But ultimately, I don't think it's a... I think that the lobbying seems to have come from pretty respectable organisations like the Institute of Chartered Accountants, England and Wales, and the Law Society, and those. You'd be pretty hard pressed to say that they were a front for anybody else. But is there an organisation to prove that's the case or not? Not just your personal opinion. Thank you.
All right.
Okay, very good. Take that back. Got any? Yes, the question here. Can I give you this microphone? Okay.
So my question was on draft bills, which we covered in an earlier lecture. The literature seemed quite split. Some argued that it sort of radically redrew the relationship between the executive and MPs, whereas others have argued it's really more rhetoric than sort of reality. I just want to know what your view on that is.
On the general principle, specialists will disagree on it. In this particular case, I don't see any difference that the draft bill actually made. They were pretty much committed to what they were going to do. The opposition that came was opposition that probably would have come anyway. There was still quite a lot of stuff, as I remember, that needed to be sorted out even after the draft bill was published. So I guess in this case, my inclination would be towards that didn't make a huge amount of difference. But I wouldn't want to generalise across the whole of the draft bill process on that.
Yep, one over here.
So my question is a bit more on the normative side. So last week I was reading an article that kind of took Piketty's idea of capital and how that increases faster than income, and how that kind of helps the 1%. And the article seems to suggest that the most powerful tool that the wealthy in society have is their ability to give their opinions forward during the kind of with pressure groups, for example, and that they have so much more sway than the average citizen. I'm just wondering if you kind of agreed with that diagnosis or not.
I think it's a very important question. It's an important question that a lot of political science has tended to ignore. There is some quite interesting work going on in the United States at the moment, by a chap called Page, strangely enough, but no relation as far as I'm aware. And he actually started to look at the question about public opinion. Does public opinion shape public policy? And his argument was actually public opinion of wealthier people differs quite substantially from the opinion of less wealthy people. And if you're looking for any coincidence between policy and public opinion, you should look at the opinion of what it is large interest groups think, what the wealthy think, whereas what citizens tend to think becomes less important. So I think there's quite a bit of it's promising evidence. I don't think it's absolutely conclusive, but it's actually promising evidence. I think that I'm not sure that I would necessarily see that it works within this case, but there are. If you were a lawyer going through the types of choices that were made in terms of who had access, whose property was actually harder to get and whose was easier to get, you might find it's the smaller criminal. If you can say that the big criminal is somehow people who have got large amounts of money can somehow get rid of. But it comes back to this other point. I don't really think it was necessarily a question of lobbying, but there might be some biases. It's just easier. I think that if police can confiscate smaller sums of money under £1,000, that just might be easier to get through. And it's the adage of the rich what gets the pleasure and the poor that gets the blame, even among criminals. But I do think there's a point. I think that's a perfectly valid point. I'm not sure that we know enough about it to say precisely how it works through the policy-making system. But bigger interests, not necessarily criminal interests, but bigger interests are more likely to be listened to. That's pretty much for sure, I think, with some exceptions depending on the circumstances. And the evidence we have from the United States suggests this is a much more widespread phenomenon than we actually thought. So, yes, I'm not sure. It's not a very satisfactory answer to what you're saying, but at least acknowledging that this is something we need to look at.
And presumably legislation subsequent to this about, I think there was legislation about regulating banks, or indeed efforts to stop tax evasion and avoidance, or aggressive tax avoidance, that an analysis of that would begin to answer the question whether there were ways of lobbying for very powerful groups that were outside the kind of conventional descriptions that inevitably most legislation would
the way to
consider.
Answer that, and this isn't a facetious point, is read Private Eye. There's quite a lot of that sort of stuff every week in the way in which things work. In terms of HMRC going after people and the sort of the deals that are done.
Rich food for research.
It is,
rich
yes.
food for research.
Hard to do, actually.
Hard to do.
But important, I think.
Okay, there's one more there, I think. Just take one more.
Hiya. From the slides that you showed us, I just wanted to make the point that I think the Minister's got more control than you give him credit for. That was just an observation. That's something that I've picked up while I've been working in the civil service. And I wanted just to ask you a question. You talk about the junior civil servants writing the policies. Now, there's actually quite a high turnover of junior civil servants. They move on quite quickly. They move on within the service or externally. But you also talk about the juggernaut of incrementalism, this idea of policies layering up on each other. So how do you square the circle there if it's actually a different cohort writing each policy? Are we talking about an organisational memory, or is there some constraint within the system?
Yep, that's a very good question. The first point, I hope I didn't say that ministers don't have any control. Because
you didn't say they didn't, but
if a minister wants,
a little bit
I think my point, point is that if a minister wants something and they say it, they will get it done. There's absolutely no doubt about that. The trouble is they don't always know what they want. They don't always have time to get bothered with some of the stuff. And that's where civil servants are trying to guess what the minister might want if the minister had thought about it. I mean, it's that sort of thinking. So I don't think we're disagreeing. I just wanted to make it clear. I didn't want to make it clear that I thought. The second point, yes, this juggernaut of incrementalism. Well, it's a very interesting point. I calculated that the people I was talking to were in office, were in the same position for around about 3 years. So they would move, so it's quite possible that they might even have taken on this build team work fairly early on. They might not have been in the place for very long, and they might move off afterwards. How does that square with the incrementalism? Is it a question of memory? Not really, I think, because if you're putting together a piece of legislation, you have to think, and your solicitor will tell you that when you're going to instruct parliamentary counsel, that there are sort of norms and procedures of law which are going to constrain you. There are existing constraints of existing law, which mean you've got to fit in with existing law. So that's one reason why you might not deviate substantially from the status quo and add to the status quo. And there's a classic argument about what incrementalism is. It's a sort of a shortcut. That if you're going to be wanting to if you're going to want to change policy, it's a high risk strategy to change policy completely. The best way is to rely on stuff that you know sort of works at the moment, which is the present, and mess around with what's going on at the present. So I think there are a number of reasons why. The turnover point is an important one. Lots of people would argue that maybe civil servants should be in a same position for much longer. Britain isn't entirely unusual in that respect. That if you look to Germany, there are some. It's a very much more mixed position where in some agencies you can go, in parts of ministries you can go into, you can find there's an instant turnover, or sort of pretty much the same sort of turnover you get in Britain. Other places there is a sort of tradition of people being specialists and being in this job for an awful lot longer. But it is, it's a common argument about why things go wrong because civil servants move too fast. It's possibly true, but there are quite a lot of things that keep you, I guess, on the straight and narrow, including the imperatives of and constraints of your existing job and the existing policy. So people don't tend to diverge quite substantially. In fact, if people were new, you might actually expect them to want to change things radically as soon as they come in. It's an important issue, and it's an issue which the civil service gets, and civil service reformers get interested in at different times. But I'm not sure that I would necessarily say that it's a terribly bad thing that people move on fairly often.
Okay. Just one final thought. I mean, in their book, The Blunders of Our Government, King and Crew, talk about, it's not entirely new concept, but it's an interesting one, about one of the explainers for legislation which seriously fails to deliver on the objectives that politicians originally have for it is, I think, what they call cultural disconnect. That is that the people forming the legislation, and particularly in government, and the people at whom the legislation is aimed are in such different places that the legislation is always going to be hard. Do you think that this excellent case study on the Proceeds of Crime Act 2002 sort of fits in that classification?
Well,
or is that unfair?
I think it's probably unfair because a lot of the Home Office types who were developing it were pretty much in touch with the police officers at the time. It's just such an incredibly difficult area to try to get money off people when you've got to have a pretty substantial organisation. You've got to have the courts on your side, or you've got to have a set of rules which are going to produce court decisions. It's a pretty complicated thing to do. I don't think you can necessarily say that these people were disconnected. It was just an incredibly hard thing to do. And of course they thought they did a good job at the time, because otherwise nobody would do any job if they thought that they were going to make a mess of it and all the time. I think subsequent events have shown some of the flaws, but I don't think that there weren't that many people around saying from ACPO or anywhere else that was, as far as I'm aware, that were saying this can't possibly work.
Okay, well look, once again, thank you very, very much. We must finish now. Others will be waiting to get in. Okay, very good. Next week we will hear from Professor Charlie Beckett on media politics and government. Look forward to seeing you again then.